Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulina Muhammad al-Amin, wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Welcome back to these sessions discussing Javed Ahmed Ghamidi and his counter-narrative. We're now at the stage in our discussion where we are delving into the article that really sort of the origin point for the public discussion with regard to this idea of a counter-narrative to our traditional religious narrative. These ideas with regard to the counter-narrative are ones that Javed Ghamidi has been discussing for many decades now as part of his research and his work on just understanding the religion of Islam, the Quran, the prophetic tradition better. Sort of discourse with regard to a counter-narrative is just an extension of what he has understood with regard to the faith up to this point in his scholarly journey. And for the general public, their exposure to this comes in the form of an article that he wrote entitled Islam and the State, a Counter-Narrative, which was published simultaneously in Urdu. It's sort of originally written in Urdu by Javed Ghamidi, and then an English translation as well that occurred around 2015 or so, or prior to that. Now, what this article does, and these sessions that then Javed Ghamidi had some months after publishing this article, the Dallas lectures, which we are basically, I'm going through and trying to help us understand and put into English language, are meant to elaborate on and explain the points that he raises in this article on the counter-narrative. And there are 10 main points, and we're going to systematically go through them. But the article begins with a reflection on the current state of affairs in the world. And he notes, and he's really specific with regard to this in the Muslim world, right, is what he's reflecting on. And he notes that, quote, the situation created for Islam and Muslims in the world today by certain extremist groups through their actions is the severe consequence of the strain of thought being taught in our religious seminaries, and which is being propagated by various movements and political parties continuously, end quote. So that's where he's beginning. And essentially, he is laying out the fact that this problem, this situation that has been created for Islam and for Muslims by the behavior of various extremist groups, and then tangentially or connected to that, various other movements and political parties. That behavior and its severe consequences is why he is essentially putting forward this counter-narrative. In previous lectures, I've gone through and discussed what Ghamidi considers the traditional narrative to be that is being taught in seminaries, right? What we are seeing, this behavior from extremist groups, the sort of the thing that is being propagated by other movements, all of that is a consequence, is a severe consequence of what is being taught in our religious seminaries. And what is being taught there is that traditional narrative, which I've tried to explain Ghamdi's views on, or his understanding of, in the past lectures. And what he says is these ideas are taught in religious seminaries and then picked up on, the foundational ideas picked up on by Islamic movements and political parties that structure it to their own agendas. They don't necessarily put it in a legalistic or a fiqhi manner, right? But they'll put it forward, or it helps structure the type of agenda that they want to put forward, right? They find different ways to express it. And here he speaks about Sayyid Qutb's work, Abdul Qadir Auda's work, other thinkers, even some of the writings of Maulana Maududi. What he explains is that when the traditional narrative is taught in madrasas, it's done in a classical fiqh style, in a classical sort of juristic learning style, right? It does not appear as a narrative, as an all-encompassing narrative in those contexts, in the context of the madrasa. Nor does it even appear as a dawah or a type of sort of strategy for propagation. It appears in parts, it appears scattered in various subjects that are studied in the madrasa. However, because the overarching narrative or interpretation is still the intellectual world in which those religious seminaries exist and the students there study in, this traditional narrative manifests in various rules and ideas and principles that are studied and taught there. Now, on the other hand, when this narrative appears in the literature of various movements or political parties, then it finds a more comprehensive shape. The narrative then lifts up out of the scattered form in which it might be found in madrasa education and starts taking on a more enveloping ideological platform, right? In some respects, Ghamidi says, the narrative is dormant in the madrasa, like a dormant volcano. It's present, but hasn't yet coalesced into an ideology as such, or a narrative. And then it becomes the basis of a comprehensive sort of ideology propagated by Islamic movements for their own ends. And this is the second stage, right? The first stage is its presence in the scattered form within the madrasa education. Its second stage is those scattered pieces being coalesced and kind of put together in an ideology that's pushing forward or being propagated by Islamic movements for their particular agendas. The third stage, then, Ghamidi argues, occurs when states begin to exploit religious sentiments for their own political ends. And in the process, they activate, operationalize this ideology. And for Ghamidi, this is what occurred with regard to Pakistan and the United States in Afghanistan in the late 70s, early 80s. That what happened there was that narrative that had been in scattered forms, that then had started taking shape, ideological shape, and becoming a platform, a comprehensive type of narrative through different movements, that then it was grabbed onto by state power, Pakistani state, the American state, and used for political ends in Afghanistan in the fight against Russia. Some might say in a somewhat short-sighted way. But what they did was this dormant idea, like a dormant volcano, was then made to erupt. And as a result, presents the danger that it does today. Right? The narrative for Ghamidi is piecemeal and present in various subjects that are studied in religious seminaries. It underlies the various legal rules that students learn, but it lacks any cohesive form in the madrasa. It never comes together to take the shape of a comprehensive religious narrative, right? Because that's not what the madrasa education is necessarily seeking to teach. It's there, it's present, it exists in those subjects, but they are not learning. There's no subject called the traditional religious narrative in the madrasa. Religious movements are what give the narrative its cohesive form, because their interest is in galvanizing people to propagate the faith or to acquire political power. And that requires, in Ghamdi's view, a narrative that is fully formed, whose all the parts of that narrative have been brought together. Right? So they, in terms of these movements, bring to life the traditional narrative. And then it's made operational by those states and arguably non-state actors who need it for political ends. So for Ghamdi, the circumstances and extremist violence that have taken hold in various parts of the Muslim world, among those populations in those parts, should not be thought of simply as a consequence of economic or social factors or some particular madness that has captured those individuals, right? Some sort of that these are irrational actors. Behind these circumstances that exist, for Ghamdi is a foundational ideology, a unique narrative that has incredibly solid foundations, and solid in some respects reasoning as well. And it's no small matter. To shake this reasoning, to shake this narrative, is to introduce an entirely new world. Ghamdi says, look, and this is understood by folks. When you ask religious scholars, Islamic scholars, Muslim scholars, why don't you raise your voice against sort of terrorism and terrorists? Why don't you work to stop them? Many of them, you will notice, he says, are not quite ready to do this. And in many respects, he's particularly speaking about the situation in Pakistan. That's really sort of the context that he is most familiar with, but also is most illustrative of the stark issues and consequences of this religious narrative around Islam and the state. He would say that it probably applies everywhere, but for the context of Pakistan, that's where his particular interest is. And he'll say that Muslim scholars won't raise their voice. They're not quite ready to do that. You know, they might do it piecemeal here and there. They're willing to speak out against certain elements of the behavior or certain steps that were taken by extremist groups. They may even speak out against sort of this behavior, these ideas, with various caveats or exceptions. They may say, oh, this behavior is unacceptable, but it's okay in Israel, or it's okay in Afghanistan because of the presence of foreign armies. But it's not acceptable in Pakistan, or something along those lines. But what they never do is they never debate the foundational premise upon which these actions are built, because Ghamdi argues they are operating under the same premise, they are operating with the same traditional religious narrative. And what he says is, look, if this truly is the actual narrative of Islam, if this traditional religious narrative is the actual narrative of Islam, then in truth, it becomes an imperative for all of us. Ghamdi says, including himself, right? If this is truly the narrative of Islam, then we can really only talk about critiques in the strategy of implementation. But nothing more comprehensive can be said about groups like the Taliban and their ideology, or Al-Qaeda and their ideology. The suitability of their actions in that instance then might be debated, but not their overall religious thought. And clearly, since we're presenting Ghamdi's counter-narrative, he does not think that this is the actual narrative of Islam. And he says, sadly, that religious scholars, Muslim scholars, have not even had the courage to acknowledge this, to openly declare that the thought that they are standing on, the legal principles they are endorsing, the objectives that they have, and by they, I mean these sort of groups like the Taliban, extremist groups, etc., that all of them are correct and that we stand with them. That religious scholars, Muslim scholars, won't declare that openly, even though Ghamidi believes that many of them, that's where they stand. And what they will do is they'll just talk about the strategy is wrong, that they're going about this the wrong way. And in fact, if they had just been open and declared this, they might have avoided a lot of confusion that has resulted, right? And look, if Ghamidi himself, he says, had felt this way, then he could go no further than critiquing strategy or methods either. The strategy and methods of obtaining the goals that if he felt the way that he believes these other scholars do, that these are goals that we all share. That we're going after the same thing, we're just disagreeing with the manner in which those goals are achieved. But what Ghamidi says is because of what Imam Farahi has done with regard to recentering the Quran and examining everything in the light of the Quran, then those historical moments, or even at times individual reports, khabar wahid, from the Prophet's life, cannot stand by themselves. They have to be viewed in light of the Quran. The Quran is the final authority on religion. And what becomes clear is that for Ghamidi, this narrative, this traditional narrative of Islam, is not the correct one. And he has gone through what he believes to be, Ghamidi has gone through what he believes to be the correct narrative in his book Meezan, in comprehensive detail. Because this traditional narrative, he says, impacts all parts of the faith. But for the purposes of his article, Ghamidi is only focusing on the relationship between Islam and the state. And what he's putting forward is a counter-narrative that is challenging this narrative that has become widespread. And he says one important thing to note, one really important thing to bear in mind, is that to address this traditional religious narrative in a Muslim society, to address it, to fix it, to remedy it, you cannot utilize secularism. That the remedy for the traditional religious narrative is not built on advocating for secularism. It is only a counter-religious narrative that can provide a solution. To suggest the removal of religion or addressing these matters through discourse outside of religion, or trying to first make irrelevant to the individual and collective lives of Muslims, to make religion irrelevant to the collective lives and individual lives of Muslims, is what he calls a foolish proposition, with absolutely no hope of success. He says the tragedy of many of our new intellectuals in the Muslim world is that they have tried to address these matters of religious extremism through the lens of the Reformation that took place in the West. And their thinking is that just as in Europe, there was first a reformation of religion, then an industrial revolution, then the rise of science, then other stages of development, etc., that if we Muslims go through these stages, then we will also arrive at where the West has arrived. And we will have a separation of church and state alongside that. That our success for these new intellectuals is built upon following the stages that were followed in the West, and that includes reforming, separating, making religion on the margins. But what Ghamidi says is this has been tried and failed. It was tried in Turkey. It was tried in Egypt for a long period. And these efforts have failed. And in his view, they will continue to fail. For him, it is simply not possible. In fact, in many places, he says, where they have tried to push secularism in many Muslim jurisdictions, Muslim societies where they've tried to push secularism, they have in fact been forced to forego democracy, to get rid of democratic principles, and instead move towards authoritarianism because that is the only way to push these ideas on populations that are not receptive to them. In addition, he says, the major difference in what happened in the West is that the movement was against the church, not really against religion itself. He says, we know what the church had become in Europe, the power it had acquired over spiritual and political matters. It had to go. It ended up being counter to human nature, according to Ghamidi. And so for Ghamidi, the revolt against the church was a revolt led by human nature, led by fitra. Because the idea that some people are divinely appointed and carry an authority over the fate of other people, in Ghamidi's view, this idea is impossible to accept for anyone but prophets. Only prophets can have that type of authority. No other figure can. And so human beings for him will accept that from prophets, but nowhere else. God employs methods, the methods that God employs, Ghamidi says, even to get people to accept prophets who are claiming this mantle of authority over their fates is quite elaborate. If you look at the biblical prophets, the types of things that through God they were able to do according to the biblical record, according to the Quran, the miracles performed, etc. All of those were methods that God was using, Ghamidi says, to get people to accept prophets as those individuals, as individuals who can have some mantle of authority over their lives. On the other hand, right, as opposed to the institution of the church, religion itself, he says, is actually a part of human nature. Hence, removing it from a person's life, where it has a natural place, that constitutes a revolt against human nature, right? For him, when you decide to reject or not accept some content of religion, so this is an additional point now. He says that when you decide to reject or not accept some content of religion, this requires some thought, right? In your individual capacity, this occurs regularly. You reject, you accept some content, etc. But removing something from a religion requires religious authority, not worldly authority, right? Removing, for instance, the legal guidelines from Christianity was not done by worldly authority, he says, but by St. Paul, a religious authority. He separates the law of the Torah from Christianity, even though Jesus is stating this should not happen. In Islam, this separation, this removal of religion, or removing content from religion, it's just not possible. Because when people will read the Quran and study their faith, how are you going to remove the law from it? Are you going to ban them from studying their faith? Ataturk tried this in different ways, and it backfired. So the entire discourse of secularism ends up falling short because the collective conscience, according to Ghamidi, the collective conscience of Muslims reject this. So there are only two options. There are only two options. Either accepting the current religious narrative as the true one, and then you say you reject it. You say, hey, this current traditional narrative is true, but I reject it. And this essentially removes you from the community. Or putting forward another interpretation of the same caliber, a truer interpretation of Islam from its sources, something that's able to challenge centuries of scholarship, that has reinforced the traditional narrative. And Ghamidi says this is what he's trying to explain and bring forward. If this counter-narrative is strong and based on solid reasoning, then it's possible it will give rise to a counter-movement. But if you pursue secularism as the approach, he says it will fail, and it has always failed in Muslim societies. Even those places where it took hold, the traditional religious narrative ends up emerging even stronger in those societies, and he gives Malaysia as a prime example. All right. So this idea then of a counter-religious narrative whose seeds were planted 100 years or so ago with Imam Farahi and his articulation of a recentering of the Quran, if you will. And this presentation then to the general public of this counter-narrative has only happened less than a decade ago. In other words, it's in its infancy. And the process it must go through will encounter resistance because of what it proposes to do, which is alter the manner in which we have understood core ideas within Islam. It is a paradigm shift. And in these lectures, Ghamidi is going to put forth a summary of the key points, or that's what he does, and we're going to explain, relating to Islam and the state, which are impacted by the counter-narrative. And he's going to explain how the counter-narrative changes the way that we have understood essential features of the relationship between Islam and the state. He is, in essence, trying to correct the record with regard to what the Islamic faith says about this relationship between religion and the state. And he's going to do that point by point, or at least for these 10 key points that he thinks are most essential. I look forward to getting into more of it. وقولي قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم وسائر المسلمين.